Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 10th day of May in the year of our Lord 2024. I will be looking at the wars in Gaza and Ukraine along with other events in our world today and asking, who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? How are we to know for sure? Does black and white even exist anymore, or is the reality of today's world nothing but gray? My beat is philosophy today as I look at real events happening in our world and how the media, that is supposed to reveal facts to us, but often is no more than the propaganda arm of the regime in power at the moment. Sometimes it seems it's even difficult to know what or who is the real regime in power at the moment and what is just an illusion. For example, the nation of Israel as it now exists and I are approximately the same age, having both been born in 1948. For all my life, I have thought of Israelis as the good guys, but now the media gives us the idea that roles might be reversing and Israel's neighbors are suddenly wearing the white hats. I have seen the wars fought by Israel since 1948 and admired the courage and intelligence of the little country defending itself against much more populous enemies. The Israelis are also the good guys because they are a Western nation with Western values right in the middle of a lot of countries still mired in the Middle Ages. The bad guys fight with terrorism. They denigrate women to second our lower class status and they throw gays off buildings. Now we seem to be witnessing a role reversal whereby the Israelis are presented to us as the terrorists and those in Gaza are the victims. However, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said recently that the Israelis are fighting terrorists. Of course, that means the end of the story. The Speaker was trying to justify passage of the foreign aid bill, which indebts Americans for $95 billion for the benefit of foreign governments and their wars. The U.S. tells its people and the world that Hamas is terrorist. Therefore, should be fought with Israeli blood and American money. But Washington also sends $9 billion to Hamas. I mean Gaza, folks. I'm sorry. It's all very confusing. Making sense of it seems close to impossible. Remember that on October 7th of last year, Hamas attacked civilian targets inside Israel, killing 1,400 and taking some 250 hostages they still hold or have killed. There are also horrific images of rape and child murder presented to us. Now, however, virtually the entire world's media tells us that the Israelis have used the wrong tactics in their war against Hamas. Many women and children have been killed. Civilians in Gaza are starving, they say. And recently I came across a story of dogs eating corpses in the streets of Rafah, which is now subject to an Israeli invasion. The people in Washington who make our decisions and do our thinking say that the Israelis should not invade Rafah. In response, the Israelis say we're going to invade Rafah with or without American help. So President Biden makes a decision to withhold shipments of vitally needed ammunition to Israel. I suppose the president is having trouble deciding who the good guys are in this struggle as well as anyone else. Maybe he is concerned about the base that is being reflected to him from college campuses across America right now. Democrats don't want enemies on the left, and the chance of Genocide Joe must raise alarms with him about re-election. I want to point out that Hamas is the government of Gaza, although Gaza is under Israeli military control. Hamas is not a traditional military force, has very little traditional military capability. It has no tanks, no air force, no long-range artillery, no navy. It is vastly outgunned by the Israelis, who have a seemingly endless supply of high-tech weapons from the Americans. Its military campaigns, as a result, tend to be of a terrorist nature, usually conducted with the support of other terrorist groups in the Middle East. Lack of a high-tech military is not an excuse to attack non-military targets, just an explanation. The Israelis are Jews. That's part of the problem, isn't it? Many folks believe they are God's chosen people, and therefore America must support them by sending weapons and money and by attacking their enemies. Many people see the Jews as the real enemy, and they apparently believe God chose the wrong side. It is really very difficult to know, especially given the distrust of the media, knowing that the media is most of all the ministry of propaganda. The young profess to know. They camp out on Ivy League campuses to let the world know that they know. We then find indisputable evidence that many of the young are being paid handsomely to know. They are paid in cash by George Soros and his various front organizations, armed with the knowledge that many of these college students are not students at all, but paid organizers and disruptors. The authorities in various states, cities, campuses send in the police to break up their camps and send them home. That's an advantage the kids at Columbia and UCLA have over the kids in Gaza. They can just go back to class comforted with the knowledge that they tried and they made their point. I invite you to look at the statistics, widely reported, but especially so by Statista. And you will see that since George Bush's war on terror began, about 20,000 people have been killed in terrorist incidents, most of them in the Middle East. How many have been killed fighting terrorism? Who knows, folks? Who knows? But I would wager it's in the millions. So once again, the action is the reaction. Go back to God for a moment. Try to discern whose side he is on in this struggle. Is he on the side of his chosen people, who, after all, are simply defending themselves? Could he be on the side of the women and children starving in the rubble of Gaza? Whose side is he on? Well, that's a good question. Who knows these things for certain, because aren't those who claim they know immediately suspect? What decision does God want one to make, even with one's own children? What discipline, if any, should be imposed? What school, if any, should they attend? These are all important, often mind-boggling questions, let alone the questions of life and death that people in Gaza and Israel face each day. So who does God favor in this struggle? We can discern patterns from history, of course, sometimes going back centuries in this ongoing struggle. Purges, genocide, ethnic cleansing, concentration camps, mass murders, crimes so horrible they're hard to think about. Speaker Mike Johnson tells us we're killing bad guys with our debt. That is our money. And it's obvious that we are killing a lot of bad guys. How many bad people have been killed in all the unnecessary wars since World War II that Washington just had to fight? I don't know, folks. I don't claim to know, but I'll bet it's a lot. Let's not forget that Washington is funding other wars in addition to Israel-Gaza. The recently passed foreign aid bill provides money to keep the Gaza war going and make it worse. Money to keep the killing fields in Ukraine, along with money to provoke a future war with China. That act also included something called the Repo Act, which authorizes the president to steal any Russian assets, including U.S. Treasury securities that fall under U.S. jurisdiction. So, Russia invested in the safe haven of U.S. debt by purchasing treasury bonds. Washington repays the Russians by telling them not only is it going to steal their bonds and not repay them, but it's going to give them to Zelensky for his proxy war against Russia. Only about $10 billion of Russian assets are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, so Washington's instinct to steal is somewhat limited. However, Washington's NATO allies in Europe have about $290 billion of Russian assets under their control, and they are apparently being pressured by Washington to steal those assets and contribute them to the common Ukraine fund. That would obviously mean that Russia would be funding its enemies for years to come, and the death and destruction would continue indefinitely. The decision of whether to steal on such a massive scale will apparently be made in June at the G7 summit in Italy. Putin would probably retaliate to this by confiscating or stealing all international property inside Russia, so the saga continues. So what if Russian property is stolen, thus making a pointless, stupid war even more so, because Ukraine is wearing the white hat, Putin the black hat. Congress told us the other day that little Ukraine is in the right. Ukrainian flags flew inside the U.S. House of Representatives. Very inappropriate to me. But what do I know about which side is the right side? It was a little reminiscent of all the Hamas flags flying over U.S. colleges. If God is on the side of Ukraine, then he must think that 500,000 dead are just a beginning. And Ukraine must have at least a few very old or very young left to sacrifice. Perhaps Washington's plan is to bleed Russia using Ukrainian blood until NATO can more safely intervene to make it really bad, perhaps even global. Let's take a brief look at what Washington tells us and try to discern a few simple facts without rancor or propaganda. In 2014, the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine, which then included Crimea. That deposed a duly elected leader who happened to be friendly toward Russia and replaced him with a leader friendly toward the U.S. 3 months later, Putin annexed Crimea and made it part of the Russian Federation in 2021. NATO, despite many promises not to do so, began formal talks to admit Ukraine as a member. If accepted in NATO, then NATO and probably U.S. missiles would be less than 300 miles from Moscow. In February of 2022, Russia began what Putin called a special military operation in Ukraine. The result has been the deaths of some 500,000 Ukrainians and an unknown number of Russians, but Ukraine has not been admitted to NATO. So far, Putin hasn't proven to have been bluffing. He told the West he would do something, and he did it. He recently said if the West steals Russian assets, he will seize all the property of Western investment in Russia currently owned by huge Western corporations. He just seized $440 million from J.P. Morgan. President Biden seems to know better than I do that God is on Washington's side in this struggle. He told us that while we are helping the people in Ukraine, we're also rebuilding and modernizing America's military infrastructure. By that, he means that the transfer of more than $100 billion in U.S. munitions has greatly depleted U.S. stocks, and if Washington is going to continue funding death and destruction, then supply chains, ammunition plants, and the like will have to be rebuilt and modernized. The result is that U.S. defense stocks are a very good investment and will be for some time in the future. This whole thing of financing this war with U.S. debt and Zelensky's demand that Washington enter into a 10-year funding plan with him smells like desperation to me. Ukraine is running out of men and equipment. The Russian army is much larger and stronger than it was before the war. Perhaps Washington will soon regret, if it doesn't already, poking the bear, I don't know for sure, who God favors in this struggle. Maybe he watches in amusement. Maybe he watches in sadness, but in any event, he seems willing to let stupidity and hubris rule in the minds of men. The danger of escalation is extreme, and as Ukraine runs out of grist for the death mill, it looks toward Europe. Would France send troops to western Ukraine to free up Ukrainian troops stationed there to be sent to the meat grinder? That decision would likely cause the war to spread across Ukraine to NATO's borders. House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries, appearing on 60 Minutes the other day, said we can't let Ukraine fall because that would mean U.S. servicemen and servicewomen would have to be committed, folks. That man doesn't need to be a U.S. congressman, let alone a minority leader, although he does let us see the absolute madness in the minds of U.S. leaders. They are willing to carry the insanity all the way to the last dead American, I guess. Hopefully, Mr. Jeffries was simply trying to bully and intimidate the American people to keep funding the debt. Finally, folks, I'll close this report with a few words from Dr. Ron Paul. Quote, when President Biden signed the $95 billion bill to keep wars going in Ukraine and Gaza and to provoke a future war with China, he called it a good day for world peace. Yes, and war is peace. Debt is good. Freedom is slavery. We are living in a post-truth society where billions spent on pointless wars are not a whole lot of money, but the piper will be paid and debt will be cleared, end quote. At least that's the way I see it. Until next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.